So I think the first thing that I would probably want to discuss is what it means to be dealing with pharmaceutical companies, which are living in this space that's really above any country's laws and above any country's ability to regulate. They're supernatural, national. They're just kind of moving around in this. It's almost like the Wild West of global corporations where they're beholden to nobody. I would meet some very dynamic, very talented individuals, maybe when I'm working on a project and we're talking to a pharmaceutical company about a trial that they did or some data that they had, or somebody wants to hire us for an analysis, and you meet these very talented people. And then I'd call them 6 months later and, they're like, oh, so-and-so doesn't work for Canada anymore. They've gone to global. And I was like, what's global? Right. And so this kind of happens systematically. And then I realized that every single pharmaceutical company has now taken the best and the brightest, and they've organized them at a global level. And these companies now basically make marketing plans that they then deploy worldwide. And so you've got this coordinated fashion, and, they work with, NGOs at a global level. They work with, tech companies. They, the leverage and the reach that they have, and the resources that they have to deploy and leverage across countries is incredible. And I remember when I first started in the industry, it was always like, you better be good to Health Canada and you better do what they say. And, the regulators were in charge, right? If they want to do business in a given country, they need to dip down. But now what you see them doing is organizing at a global level to rewrite the regulations so it's not so difficult to operate in a level. So, it's like, who's the boss?
Who's representing the interests of the taxpayer here? If you're talking about value for money, quality, benefits exceeding harms, you've got the drug companies, their drug company industry associations. You've got many politicians who are in ridings that have pharmaceutical industry companies where they're very much beholden to that kind of thing. And then you've got consumer groups who the federal government doesn't really fund consumer activism in terms of drug regulation, and they go to pharma. So all the patient groups, the patient advocacy groups, they almost universally speak with a voice of more, faster, the same talking points that the drug industry uses.
There are consumer groups out there funded by big corporations to give the input, in the regulatory process that the big corporations funding them want. After you're at Health Canada for a while as a drug approval scientist, you learn how they're going to get around your decision that we should not approve a drug. And how it works, as she explained, is so the Health Canada drug approval scientist will do their job and recommend that a drug not be approved. And then the senior management above them, which are never doctors or scientists, which is curious, they will appoint an outside panel of experts who will be connected to the pharmaceutical companies. And this outside panel of experts will review the application and determine that it should be approved. And you'll never know who voted on it, so there's no liability there. And then the senior management just takes the recommendation of this panel of outside experts, so they're not liable, and the drug gets approved. And as she explained, after you've been at Health Canada long enough, you recognize that this is the way they're going to get around your decisions.
Basically, one of the things that pharmaceutical companies realized was that there was a real benefit to partnering with patient advocacy groups and funding them. And the phase of a marketing campaign, there's the pre-marketing phase. The goal is to raise awareness of the condition or disease that you ultimately want to treat in the mind of the consumer, and also to prepare the government to think that this is a problem, so that then when you release your phase 3 data, you've got patient advocates that are demanding and making a ruckus and putting pressure on the government in order to approve that drug. So, in breast cancer, what breast cancer would be a perfect example, they would sponsor, breast cancer advocacy groups then they would do runs for cancer, and it would go in the media, and there would be this, and we need to treat breast cancer, and I can't believe you're not going to treat a breast cancer patient. And then all that money gets raised, and then of course there's a company behind it, and lo and behold, they've just launched a breast cancer drug.
The people who work at Health Canada, whose job it is to review drug studies and to give approval, they would think that their target audience, the people that are interested in their information, are the clients, happen to be the taxpayers, the citizens who ingest the drugs. They want to make sure that those drugs are safe and effective. The problem is that the companies themselves pay the regulator to review their drugs. And so something like a half to 2/3 of the money that Health Canada gets to review and approve drugs comes from the companies themselves. So if you're working at Health Canada, you say, well, who is my client here? Well, the client is obviously the company that's paying the agency to review those drugs. It's completely ass backwards.
I mean, I think they've been trying to make vaccines for cancer for a long time. But, we talked about the way that pharmaceutical companies engaged advocacy groups to then put pressure. So the advocacy groups would basically put pressure on the media, which would then put pressure on the politicians that would then, sway their hand to influence Health Canada to get a drug approved, because, it's embarrassing if you're allowing breast cancer moms to die, or the mother of 3 is going to die if you don't approve this drug, right? I mean, they personalize it and they get it in the public eye. The mainstream media has undergone an incredible transformation that I don't think, again, many Canadians really appreciate, because the economic engine, the bread and butter of the news, so cable TV used to be like, the TV channel used to be how you paid for the news. And the news was the public service that these broadcasters or these TV channels did. And so, that's how you paid for these investigative journalists that went and sought the truth. And that's how I think there's probably been always some sort of level of bias, potentially, based on political view, depending on what news outlet it is and everything. But what he's described to me now is that they're basically broke. The federal government, is keeping them on life support.
The big mainstream media outlets, the New York Times, the major magazines, very heavily dependent, and certainly cable television, very heavily dependent on drug advertising. People tell me that you watch American TV, you're going to consume 5 or 6 drug ads per hour. I don't watch American TV, but I sometimes look at the ads online, and so you get an understanding that if there's that much money going into these outlets to produce news, is the news ever going to be credible? You don't fight the hand that feeds you. I mean, it's not conspiracy, it's business.
No,
I mean,
no. And if you have no other means of income, right. It used to be that cable television was your income, and then this was your extra. That gave you the latitude to be honest, because there's no competing things. But I mean, how can you possibly go against your main revenue stream?
The changes being brought in, to natural health products, and then you were discussing how they're relaxing the regulations for the chemical drugs. This is all tied together in my mind. So and I'll just briefly share what's happening. It's called the Selfcare framework, but it's just part of these. They're creating a regulatory pathway that will be, and you've already brought this up, kind of internationally harmonized, but it allows for this protection of intellectual property rights. And I think part of it is getting rid of the natural health products. So they just want to harmonize it so they're regulated the exact same way as the chemical over-the-counter drugs. So, but to do that, they have to soften the regulation of the chemical over-the-counter drugs. With natural health products, you can use traditional use evidence for efficacy. And, nobody's done a study on how much, but I'm guessing about 2/3 or to 3/4, even of our monograph products, they've gotten through the efficacy hurdle using traditional use evidence. And the reason why they've had to allow that in the past is there's no intellectual property rights. It all comes down to intellectual property rights. The example I like to use is Viagra, because when Viagra, got through the regulatory process, their advertising was so effective, not in Canada, but the US, and we watched Canadian or US TV back then. Like, there were news stories about how much a pill cost, but now that the patent is off and the generic drug is sildenafil, they can't charge as much because, Apotex or anyone else can make it, right? So, but a natural health product, you have no patent on it.
Right.
So you don't go through that process, because if you did succeed, then anyone can just they're all generic drugs because there's no patent.
You'll never get the investors to invest the money to do
Exactly.
the clinical research, because you're not going to get the money back on the back end, right? So it's a non-starter.
Yeah.
Like, pharmaceutical companies will make more money if they can eliminate their competition.
And if you've got a major multi-billion-dollar market in antipsychotics used for almost everything, and then some small player comes along with an effective natural treatment that treats schizophrenia or bipolar and is very effective, they will go out of their way to crush the competition.
It took me probably about 10-15 years to figure out that our drug regulations were to protect intellectual property rights. I think what we're seeing, because it's not just in the area of natural health products, but I think we're seeing basically the regulatory bodies moving us into a position where we're not going to have this competition, and how it's happening with natural health products. And I just want to make sure that the audience understands is, if we impose the chemical drug model as the only model, and so we're forcing products to have to go through a fairly strict level of clinical evidence that's expensive, it's just not going to happen. Right. Where you don't have intellectual property rights. So we're making a policy decision, likely influenced because of economic factors, is what seems to be coming out in this discussion. But we're making a policy decision to only have patented drugs, or at least drugs that had a patent when they went through the process, as the only option.
The people who are in charge and who the government is consulting with are people who are part of global corporations with branded products, who are looking to make it easier for them to push their novel therapies forward in the future. So getting the focus to go to evidence, they get to eliminate all the competition just by nature of the fact that there's no economic model there. Now, that's how they're organizing, and they're getting us to focus on it. And that's why they're getting the regulators now, because the regulators are on their side, to then raise the bar for evidence, because they know that then nobody will be able to get over that standard because they don't have the investment. And that's how they're going to eliminate their competition in terms of natural health products.
We have so many juries in the world of health and medicine, where the people are conflicted. If we just get rid of that to start with, we would have a much cleaner and more trustable system.
That things that we don't know are that there's these silent players in this game of competing interests, and pharmaceutical companies are definitely one of them, and they're everywhere. So, making sure that anybody who makes a recommendation has to say whether they've been given money from a pharmaceutical company. Public health is the marketing arm of the pharmaceutical company now, right? The federal government is the investor. They don't even have to get investment anymore. And now our public institutions, our higher learning institutions, are now going to be the research and development arms of the global pharmaceutical companies. And I think that we should be subsidizing, research for health products. Like, why shouldn't we be using that $3.3 billion that the government has to run clinical trials for vitamin D? You know what I mean? Like, I think we'd get way more bang for a buck, right?
Yeah.
I think that we just have to stand up and we have to demand stuff. We have to get educated, because they can't get away with it if we say no. If we close the pocket, if we close our bank book and we say no more money for you, using our, voting, or if we basically say, that's just not right, and we stand up, then they don't have any ability to move forward. It's only whenever they effectively censor us and people don't understand, right?